I'm Pastor Dan Shipton, and I invite you to join with us as we study the Scriptures to spur one another on in our faith. The Christ-Centered Journey is a ministry of Christ Center Community Church in Clifton, Illinois. And now, here's today's podcast. Good morning. Welcome to the Christ-Centered Journey. Today, we are looking in John chapter 19 as we move on and get closer to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Today we're still talking about his trial, and sometimes there's that saying that we go through trial by fire, and yes, he's on trial in reality, but sometimes when you go through a bad situation or a trial by fire, you have to put your trust in God because you have to rely on him to help you through that situation. Jesus in this passage is being challenged by, first, we talked about how the Pharisees and the Sadducees challenged him. We talked about the fact that he is before Pilate, and Pilate has tried not doing anything, and the people wanted Barabbas instead of Jesus. And he's actually, a lot of people say, well, Pilate's the one who did this. He did it to keep the peace with the people, because if you follow this storyline completely, you understand that Pilate was just playing a role in this. And we see that because he tried turning Jesus over once, and then they wanted Barabbas. They said they didn't want Jesus released because they tried saying he was someone who was making sedition against the government and was trying to turn people away and be the king of the Jews. But Jesus had a spiritual thing in mind, and Pilate doesn't get any of this because he doesn't see it. And we see that in the fact of how he responds, because even after they say they want him crucified or they want to change Barabbas and want his release, then it says in chapter 19, verse 1, where we're at today, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted a crown of thorns together and put it upon his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, and they went about up to him again and again, saying, "Hail the King of the Jews," striking him on the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you, to let you know what I find no basis for the charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here is the man." I want to pause there just for a moment. See, this is proof of what I was just saying. Pilate doesn't see that Jesus is a threat. Not to him, not to Rome. The Jews saw him as a threat to them. Pilate doesn't care about them. He's a Roman governor put in place by Rome. From anything, if you do studies on him, he's not even a great governor, but he was there to keep peace and knew that's what he had to do. And so he's like, just beat the guy up. We don't need to kill him. There's none of this is nonsense. And then he brings him out and says, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you. I let you know I find no charge against him." So Pilate clearly says there's no charge against him. As soon as the chief priests and the officials heard this, it says in verse 6, as soon as the chief priests and officials heard this, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." Twice now, Pilate has, actually 3 times, because the first time he said, "I really find no problem with him. Why don't we release him? You have the idea to release him, release a prisoner, or release somebody for this festival. So who do you want me to release?" And they cried for Barabbas. So that's once. Here, Pilate again, he says they will beat him up a little bit and make him know not to do anything, and his soldiers may, basically show the force of Rome, and then they bring him back out, and he says, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you. I don't find any charges." And the people say, "Crucify, crucify." And then Pilate says, "Hey, wait a minute, you do it, because I find no charge in him." 3 times now, Pilate has said, "I find no charge in him. I find no guilt." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to our law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you? And this is where it gets good. Jesus hasn't said anything through all of what we just talked about. He's been silent. Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judge's seat at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. There's a couple of things I want to point out here. First of all, Jesus was the willing sacrifice. We've said this over and over the last few days, but I want you to grasp this today. He willingly went. But then he points out to Pilate that there's no power in him. You know, Pilate's like, do you refuse to talk to me? Do you refuse to? I'm the only guy that can let you go here. I could be your friend. And Pilate doesn't find him guilty. And Jesus says you have no power over me. If it weren't given to you from above, the one who handed me over is more guilty than you. So what Jesus is telling Pilate, two things. Number one, you have no power over me. As a Christian, when you face situations, and people in our country often, in the United States often wonder, how do people go through persecution? How did they go through it in the past? How do they do it today? It's because you have to get to a point where you are committed to God, to that strength that Jesus was. You don't have any power over me. Only God has power. He's the one that makes the sun, rise and set. He's the one that created the universe. He's the one that created me for this purpose. He's the one that gave me salvation through his son. He's the one that calls us into the mission to go out and reach people for him. And guess what? That means he's in control. So if something's going on and somebody thinks they're going to destroy us or destroy the message of God, God's got a plan through what's going to happen. And Jesus recognizes God's in control. And he says, you don't have any power, Pilate. The power has been given to you from somewhere else. And in the same time, there's a second thing that Jesus does here, and that's that he basically tells Pilate, you're not guilty. You're not guilty. You see, we don't get the storyline here, but in one of the other Gospels, it tells us that when Pilate went back and forth inside the palace and out of the palace, his wife had told him not to get involved in the situation. She had a premonition that he shouldn't be involved because this was a special person. And so he had this worry on one hand because his wife had this premonition, but then he's got the pressure that the Jews are giving him, that because they start changing the tune. It's not about their law. That's what they start with. Oh, it's about their law, and he did this wrong. And then they basically say, no, Pilate, it's about your law. Anybody who claims to be the king that isn't the emperor, they're supposed to be killed because we don't need any uprisings. You're no friend of Caesar, Pilate. You see, these religious leaders knew how to work the system. They'd had a good relationship, well, not a great relationship, but a good enough relationship with Rome personally so they could become wealthy. And they were using their wealth to continue to make themselves better off. And it wouldn't take much for them to contact somebody higher than Pilate, and then he'd be out of a job. If not out of a job, maybe not even alive. And so here's what Jesus does. Jesus is basically saying, first of all, you have no power. Second of all, I'm removing the guilt off of you, Pilate, because it's not you who's going to be guilty. It's people who handed me over. They're guilty of the sin. Those religious leaders, they're the real ones, Pilate. And from then on, it says Pilate tried to free him, and this whole argument back and forth went on. But I want us to grasp this morning a couple of facts that we as followers of Christ should be grasping. Number one, even in the darkest of situations, God's still there and God's in control. It may not look like it on the surface. I mean, to the followers of Christ, I'm sure when Jesus was going to this trial and getting beaten up, and as they're watching all this, they're trying to figure it all out, saying, what's really going on? But Jesus was in control and God was still in control. And the second thing is, we should never be so bitter that we can't let things go that don't matter. In other words, if it's not about the mission of God that he's put in our hearts, then we should focus back on the mission and let some other things go. That's hard sometimes because we're in the fire. Whether people are trying to come against us, or whether it seems like the world's falling apart around us, or everything's going wrong around us, we need to let go and let God be God. Let him stay in control. I think some of us try to take control, and that's when things get worse, and it becomes our problem, not God's problem, because we've created a bigger problem out of it. It's not easy to let God be in control, because that means we got to let go of the reins. And that's not an easy thing for many of us to do. We like to have the reins of control in all situations. Jesus said to Pilate, hey, you're not in control here. You think you are. But the power is actually from someone greater than you, greater than them, greater than the world. And that's the way we need to face our situations and our problems. There's someone greater. God is greater than all these things. He's greater than the problems. He's greater than us. And then we need to be willing to forgive where forgiveness is needed. You know, when we face trials and hardships, when we face attacks, when things in the world just seem to be in an uproar, trust God, because he's with you. I pray God blesses you today on your journey. I'd like to give a shout out to my friend who does the daily Bible reading.
Have you ever made a commitment to read through the Bible in a year? Maybe you even picked up one of those one-year Bibles, and you got a few weeks, maybe even a few months in, and things were going pretty well, but you just kind of had life get in the way. Yeah, me too. I've been there. I started the Daily Bible Reading Podcast as a way to keep myself accountable, because I want to read through the Bible, and I want you to come along with me. We can do this together, holding each other accountable. Join me daily as we read through the Bible, pray, and talk about it a little bit.
Thank you for joining us today, and I pray God blesses you, and I pray that you carry those blessings into the world around you. We'd like to thank you for joining us for the Christ-centered journey, and we hope that God has blessed you today and that you will bless others. We'd invite you, if you don't have a church and you're in the Clifton area, to join Christ-Centered Community Church. You can find us by going to Facebook and find Christ-Centered Community Church. You can also look us up on Facebook at christcentercommunity.org. You can also leave prayer requests there on a prayer request line, and they go straight to me. Another thing that you can do is on Sunday mornings, we meet at 10:15 for in-person worship. Right now, on most Sundays, we are at the Parsonage at 195 West 3rd Avenue in Clifton. Once a month, at the beginning of the month, the first Sunday, we are in the community building in Clifton. We also meet at 10:15 that day, and that's on East 4th Street in Clifton. You can also find us for Facebook Live or YouTube Live shortly after our services begin at 10:15 on Sunday mornings. We hope that God is blessing you and that you carry those blessings out into the world around you.